I'm gonna cover the best 2 gears for every brawler and sometimes 3 because you guys are gonna have a lot of extra gold to craft gears after this update. Before anything else though, you will get 1 free gear to be able to craft as your first gear, and I highly recommend making it a mythic gear for either Tick or Jean. They literally cost twice as much as the other gears, and so you'll actually save gold coins doing this. Starting off with Shelly, we got speed and damage, and I'm gonna be honest, this is going to be the case for a lot of the brawlers. Speed and damage is just the best gear for over half of the brawlers in the game. Now, they're the most consistently and best gears for most maps, so I'm going to explain brawlers that don't need these so I can just save you guys some time. I'll go over all of them though, and I will mention an alternative third one for maps that don't have like hardly any bushes. And that alternative for Shelly would be health. And we're literally doing the exact same thing for Nita with health as your alternative. Next, we got Colt, who's the first one to actually be able to have the reload speed. So do that with your damage gear. Colt's a damage dealer, typically best played in Heist, and even if you're not playing Heist, this is gonna be your best bet. Next is Bull, and he's the first brawler in here for the supercharge gear, which is gonna increase his charging rate 10% faster, and then obviously his damage gear. Now his trait right here that makes it so that he charges super from damage received, it does not actually get affected by that gear, but the damage that he does deal will actually make a big impact on that. Next is Jessie, speed and damage, and honestly, you could go with either health or shield for her because she's kind of a low HP, but I'd recommend health for her. Next, we have Brock with his reload gear and his damage gear. Now, I don't think that his reload gear is particularly better for Brock, but I've always used the shield gear for him, and I think the reload gear is just a better gear than the shield gear in general. And also, it does complement his rocket number 4 star power. Next is Dynamite with the speed gear and damage gear, with the alternative being his shield gear because he has so little HP. Also, he's often hiding away behind walls, so he actually has time to actually charge that shield up. Next is Bo for reload and damage, and this is a tricky because the speed gear is actually really good for Bo on maps where you're actually going to be using his circling eagle star power. If you had to choose one between damage and his speed gear, I think that the damage gear is going to be the better one, but there's a solid argument for speed. He'd be a good one to have 3 on. Next is Tick, who is obviously going to be using his mythic gear. His head gets an extra 1000 HP. That's actually really insane. But then surprisingly, you want the health gear for him because he has his well-oiled star power that allows him to start recovering health 2 seconds faster. So even though he is a low HP brawler, health is actually pretty great on him. If you don't like running that star power, you could go with either the shield or the damage, although I think shield is probably a little bit more value. Next is 8-bit, reload and damage. This is pretty self-explanatory, just very similar to Colt. Next is Ems, and we've got the speed and the damage gear with an alternative of the health gear. Stu also has the speed and the damage gear with an alternative of the shield gear. For El Primo, I'm recommending supercharge. Charging his super is just so good for El Primo because once you have it charged up, it's really easy to keep it up. And I recommend the speed gear for a second one, which will make it a little bit easier for him to charge his super in the first place. Next is Barley, who we got the damage gear and the shield gear on. Like most throwers, he's not going to be spending a ton of time in the grass, so speed gear is not as useful for him, and the shield gear is going to help him stay alive. For Poco, we got the speed gear, and honestly, you could go with the health gear or the damage gear. Poco did recently get a nerf, so the damage gear might not be as beneficial, but he does a great job at staying alive below that 50% HP, so I think it's completely justifiable to leave it just like this. Next is Rosa. Damage gear is an obvious one, and honestly, speed gear is a very obvious one. If you don't go with speed gear, there is a little bit of a reason to use her vision gear along with her unfriendly bushes, but even then, I just think that you're gonna be playing her on bushes, so this makes sense. For Rico, 100% reload speed and damage gear. This just makes sense. He's a damage dealer, and I feel like adding any reload speed to Rico is just gonna make him insane, especially on the right map. For Jail, we got speed, we got damage, and as an alternative, we have health. For Penny, we got damage and actually vision. Damage is an obvious one for her, but for Penny, the other gears are kind of like equally good or equally not that good. I like the vision gear because it makes it harder for enemies to stay hidden from her cannon just by hiding in the bushes. And usually they're not expecting that, so it actually works out pretty well. Carl, we got speed, we got damage, and as an alternative speed, we've got health. Now Jackie's an interesting one. She does have the supercharge gear, however, I'm going to recommend the speed gear and the damage gear for her over her supercharge gear. Honestly, her super isn't that impactful, and if you're on a map with lots of bushes, I would much rather have speed for her, and the additional damage is also going to be better than her supercharge, in my opinion. However, if you're playing her on a map without bushes, then I would definitely recommend doing this. For Gus, we've got damage and shield gear. Gus already heals with his ghosts and has a super that gives him a whole other shield on top of this shield, which makes this gear just even harder to take him out. For Piper, you want the damage gear and the shield gear. Obviously, Piper likes to keep her distance, so she doesn't typically like to hang out in the bushes very often unless you're going to be using her ambush star power. But even then, she doesn't necessarily need more movement speed because she's already hiding in a bush that's already safely away from enemies. Otherwise, she gets out of the bush. And this build honestly applies to most long-range sharpshooters in the game. Pam's pretty standard. We got speed gear, we got damage gear. An alternative to the speed gear is the health gear. Now for Frank, you don't actually matter too much how much damage he deals because if you're close to him and you charge up his super, they're going to be dead anyway, which is why you want the speed and the health gear because he has so much HP. This health gear is just so insane for him. For BB, you want speed, you want damage, and an alternative for speed, you've got health if you are on an open map. B's just like Piper. You want the damage gear and you want the shield gear. Now for Nani, you want the health gear and the supercharge gear. The supercharge gear, although it doesn't work with Bo's super totem, is great for helping her charge up her first super, but usually then she just falls back and then wants to use her super, and at that point she can actually heal while she's using her super, which is why I like the health gear. She's not going to be dealing her maximum damage with her super when she's actually below 50% health most of the time, and so this makes a lot of sense. For Edgar, we've got the supercharge gear and the damage gear. This one makes a lot of sense, especially if you use the Let's Fly gadget. It actually pairs very well with the supercharge gear. It's insane. He basically charges up his super like he used to when this gadget first came out. Next, we got Griff, and his makes a lot of sense. He's a damage dealer. You want that reload speed. You want that additional damage. Next is Grom, another thrower, right? He wants the damage and he wants the shield gear because he's going to be hiding and staying away lots of time to be able to actually charge that shield up in the first place. Next, we got Bonnie, where you got her supercharge gear, which is going to actually charge her super automatically 10% faster when she's in her melee form, and that happens automatically. But then you got the damage gear, which just makes sense. Next is Mortis. We've got speed gear, we got damage gear, and for an alternative to him, actually, instead, I would go with the shield gear, because that extra 600 HP when he's trying to assassinate somebody can actually come in clutch pretty often. Tara's like your standard brawler. Speed, damage, and an alternative for the speed, you got health. Now, Gene's a tricky one. You absolutely want his mythic gear, the hand range. It reaches one tile further. The description says one tile further. It looks more like 1/3 of a tile to me, but the speed gear actually helps Gene keep enemies within range of his super, and that's definitely more important than damage gear or anything like that. There's an argument for his vision gear, but honestly, at that point, you might actually just do this instead. Overall, though, I think this is Gene's best build. Max is your standard brawler. We got speed, we got damage, and an alternative to it is health. For Mr. P, we've got speed, damage, and an alternative to speed, we actually have shield. Now, Sprout does have the supercharge gear. However, I don't think it's that impactful for Sprout. I would honestly rather have his shield gear along with the damage gear. It's terrible at close range, so you want the shield over the speed, plus its super destroys grass, which is another reason not to go with speed. And also, he has an entire gadget dedicated to him having a super up like 100% of the time throughout the entire match, and that's why I don't think that the supercharge gear is actually that great for Sprout. For Byron, typical long-range shooter, damage gear and shield gear. I will say though that Byron actually uses the damage gear better than most brawlers since his damage gets boosted and his healing does as well. Squeak's pretty standard, speed, damage, and an alternative is going to be health. For Spike, you want damage and the shield gear. He's a lot more equipped to deal with those close range brawlers than most sharpshooters, but he does have so little HP that the shield is very useful for him. Vision gear is also not a very bad option for him because he's really good at checking bushes. However, I think this is more useful most of the time. Now for Crow, you want the speed gear. It's going to make it easier for him to actually hit enemies when he's poking in and out of the bushes and he's faster. But for second gear, you either want vision or shield. Vision is going to be really useful against those enemies that are in bushes because they're going to stay pinged in the bush like for so long. And for non-bushy maps, shield gear. This is what I would go if I only had to pick two though. For Leon, you want the speed and the damage gear, and an alternative for him would actually be the shield gear. For Sandy, you want the speed gear, you want the damage gear, and an alternative would be the health gear. For Amber, you want the reload speed gear. This is going to be such a good gear for her because her reload speed is what really makes her struggle. And then the speed gear, which is going to make it easier for her to get close enough to enemies that she can auto aim on them and just obliterate them. For Meg, you want speed gear, you want damage gear, and an alternative for her would be the shield gear. Gale's best two are speed gear and the damage gear, with an alternative being the health gear for the speed gear. For Surge, you want speed, you want damage, and then also the shield actually. For Colette, you want speed and you want want damage, and an alternative would be her shield gear. For Lou, you absolutely want supercharge, and for his other one, his damage gear is also really fantastic. Now, this allows him to charge up his super with just one less projectile. It's not that impressive. However, when you have enemies on his actual super area, that's when things get to be really useful. Chrono's best two are speed and damage gear, with an alternative being the shield gear. For Belle, you want the reload speed. It makes a lot of sense. She's a sharpshooter. If you can have that, then that's fantastic. And then also the damage gear. I considered actually the shield gear, but she's actually not too bad at closer ranges, and so I think the damage gear is actually pretty solid for her. Buzz does best with the speed and the damage gear, with an alternative being the health gear. For Ash, you want the speed gear and you want the health gear. Even though he does have his supercharge, I think health is going to be better for him. Ash deals plenty of damage once his rage bar fills up, and the health gear makes it way easier for him to fill up his rage bar from taking damage. His supercharge gear would obviously help him charge up his super more frequently. However, if his super is up, there's a very good chance that he's actually already going to be at full rage, so I think the speed and health are definitely the go-to ones for him. Next is Lola. I would go with speed and damage most of the time, and an alternative would actually be the reload speed gear. She doesn't typically struggle with actually reloading her ammo. You usually have as much as you need when you need it, but if you can use this to get closer to enemies, usually that's the better option. For Fang, we got speed, we got damage, and an alternative would be his health gear. For Eve, she's got that reload speed gear. I think this is a fantastic one for her, so I definitely recommend this, and then her damage gear is also going to help a lot as well. For Janet, you want the speed gear, you want the damage gear, and an alternative would be her health gear. For Otis, I would go with speed and damage, and the alternative would actually be his supercharge gear. This gear only helps him charge up his ammo with one more projectile, but he can do so with the same amount of ammo with or without this. And typically having his super ready to go one projectile faster doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the right time for him to use his super. And that's why I think the speed gear most of the time is going to be the better option. For Sam, you want speed, you want damage, and an alternative would be his health gear. And there you have the best 2 gears for every single brawler in the game. Feel free to let me know if you disagree with this. Obviously, this is some of my own personal opinion, and you should definitely use your own discretion when it comes to actually upgrading your account. However, do make sure you get that free upgrade on the mythic gears first, because that will save you some coins. Make sure you subscribe for some more awesome content in the future. Leave a comment in the section below if there's something specifically you'd like to see in a video, and you can also watch these videos that are already ready for you to watch right now. For now, this is KairosTime ticking by. We will see you in Brawl Stars.